or an ABC. We've had people who were at layer 1 who came to our discipleship core. And I told them, I was like, look, man, we just talk about Jesus and read the Bible. I don't know if that's your thing right now. It's like, hey, that's all right. I'll just sit back and listen. And that's what he did. And he loved it. He actually came a whole bunch of times. So that is, always keep that in mind. It's a guideline, not a strict rule. So what I want to talk about now is a simple process for how you can actually launch a group like this. Again, we did this in a non-conventional setting, so there may be some things you have to tweak, but these are essentially the 3 phases that got us to the point of launching a missional small group that is there for the long haul. How many of you have ever seen churches launch small groups and they last like 3 months and then they all die? I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. I've seen it many times. Small groups tends to be that thing that lasts just a few months before it, sometimes a year, and then the novelty wears off and they're gone. So this is a simple process that we use to launch our small groups. It's a recommended process. So the first phase, and by the way, this is in the handouts as well. The first phase is a reimagining phase. So what you're doing here is you're not actually jumping straight into that red circle, blue circle. You're going to take your time, and you're going to journey slowly to that place. And the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to gather a team of people who are going to be part of this missional small group. And you're going to go into the reimagining phase. Now, that circle, that team that you gather is very important. You got to gather the right people. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but not everyone is a good candidate for a missional team. So we usually follow 4. Four is an acronym. You guys have probably heard it before. We didn't make it up. We just stole it. It's called FAST. Faithful, available, spiritual, teachable. FAST. If you have people in your team who are fast, your team's going to be fast. If you don't have people in your team who are fast, you have just signed yourself up for some of the most unnecessary headaches of your life. You want fast people. What do you mean by faithful? Faithful to Jesus, faithful to the gospel. This is not, your core group is not a group to bring in your friends who are deconstructing. Yes, eventually this is going to be the right space for them, but they're not the people you want to build this with. That's just not where they're at. So if you've got friends who are like, oh, I'm not sure if I, believe in God anymore, or not sure if I want to, follow Jesus anymore, you want this team to eventually be a place where they're safe, but you don't want them to be in the core team. They're just not the right person for that. It's not going to be good for them, and it's not going to be good for you. So you want them to be faithful to the gospel. Second one is you want them to be available. So when I first launched our group, we had people who signed up with all the enthusiasm and excitement in the world, and when it came down to it, they were always missing. It was like, hey guys, we're gathering here, sorry, can't make it. Hey guys, we're gathering there, oh yeah, sorry, can't make it. Hey guys, we're getting together this weekend, can you make it? Yeah, we'll be there. 10 minutes after it starts, sorry, can't make it. You just can't. People got to be available, right? You want them to be faithful, you want them to be available. That doesn't mean that they're going to be available every single time. Life happens. But if people are not willing to commit to a regular availability, it doesn't form a good core group. Faithful, available, spiritual. Now, what this means is you want people who are not only committed to the message of Jesus, but they're committed to relating to others the way Jesus does. This is the spirituality of Jesus. Now, why does this matter? Because unfortunately, and I don't know that there's really a nice way to put this, there are some people in church who are more interested in religion than they are in relationships. And those types of people usually do not make good team members. They want to argue all the time, they want to bicker, they want to nitpick, they want to get into debates. It's just not the right people for this sort of thing. I had a few people message me who were like that when I first started, saying, oh, I want to come along and join your team. And I said, no, probably not a good idea for any of us. So, and that's just the reality of it, you guys. Sometimes there's people in the community who might identify with your particular church, but who just have toxic personalities, and it's just not a good candidate for a missional team. And the last one, teachable. It ties into the one I just said, but it goes further. Teachable is someone who's willing to learn, to relearn, to imagine, to reimagine. They're not married to a particular way of doing things. They're not traditional in the sense that they're unwilling to question or unwilling to peel back the layers. They are teachable, right? This is a fast person. And so with that fast person, you can then reimagine. This is phase one, reimagine. And what we do in phase one is really, really simple, you guys. It's just 3 things. You got it there on your sheet. The first one is we read through the book of Acts. And I can send these to you, Robert. We do what's called an Acts reset. And all we're doing in the Acts reset is we're reading through the book of Acts, and we're asking ourselves, what do we see here that we don't see today? What do we see here that we don't see today? That's the first question. And the second question is, what would it look like for us to begin to experience this today? And this is important because what we're doing is essentially we're deconstructing what we think of when we think of church, but we're doing it in a biblical way. We're allowing Scripture to inform what is church? How should we be experiencing it, right? The second thing we do is, I already mentioned the second thing. The third thing that we do is a fun one. We invite everyone to actually put together a vision board. You could do this before the book of Acts or after, doesn't matter. If you do it before, then afterwards, you can look at your vision board and say, does it match what we saw in Acts? And if you do it after, then people can just bring what they experienced in Acts to the vision board. But it's essentially saying, hey, let's put together a vision board of what we believe God is calling the church to be today. And again, Acts can inform that before or after. That's really simple. Now, we're not necessarily reading through the entire book of Acts. We're really just reading chapters 1, I believe, through 11, and then chapter 17, which we were in today, Paul and Mars Hill. The rest of the chapters are just Paul's travels. So we're really reading the chapters that are more specific to the church and its mission. And this whole process generally takes about 2 months, roughly speaking, 3 months max, and you're done with reimagining. And then after reimagine, once that's finished, then you go into rediscover. This is phase 2. Phase 2, rediscover. And again, it's very, very simple. What you're doing in phase 2 is you're going back to the gospel. You're going back to the gospel. I think it goes without saying that the gospel is the absolute center of why we do what we do. If it's not the gospel, then it's not worth it. If it's not the gospel, it's not worth it. We got to go back to the gospel, back to Jesus, back to the good news, back to what he accomplished on the cross. That has to be the core. And what we do here is we actually spend a few weeks with our team just sharing what God has done in our lives. We share our testimonies with each other. We go deep, we get vulnerable. This is a really beautiful team building exercise. You'll find that core group goes from being a missional core group to a family, because you're getting real vulnerable with each other. You're sharing some deep stories. I've done this twice with different groups, and I found that people say stuff they've never shared before. They share stories of what God has done in their life, what he's saved them from, how he's, been a blessing to their journey. It's incredible. It's incredible. And bring some tissues for this one, have plenty, because there's usually a lot of crying that happens. We're going back to the gospel, but not going back to the gospel, let's have a Bible study and argue about the gospel. It's let's share what God's done in our lives. So 1 week we'll have 2 people, maybe just 1, depending on how long the story goes. And then the next week we come back, we share a few more stories, and so on. And again, we're getting vulnerable. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 usually takes, depending on the number of people, can take 2 to 3 months as well. So again, there's no rush here. Right? There's no rush here. I said to someone when we first started this, we want to reach secular people who our church has struggled to reach for forever. There's no way we're going to magically plant a church and within 2 weeks we're reaching secular people. We got to take our time here. And it reminds me of a story When I was a soldier, when I was in the Army, in 2009, I was in Iraq. And while I was there was a team of Navy SEALs that was deployed to Afghanistan to hunt down a Taliban warlord. And when the team of SEALs got there, they actually made a movie about this. Some of you may have seen Lone Survivor with Mark Wahlberg, the movie. When they got there, they were dropped off in this mountain, and their job was to hide in the mountain and then set up a sniper position and take this guy out. But while they were hiding in the mountains, they ran into a group of shepherd boys. And so now they had a dilemma. Do we kill the shepherd boys to protect our location? Or do we let them go and then they run down to the village and tell the Taliban that we're here? What do you do? Well, they decided to go with their moral compass and they let the boys go. And lo and behold, the boys ran down to the village. They told the Taliban, there's Americans up in the mountains. If I remember correctly, I think there was maybe 3 or 4 of them. It was a very small Navy SEAL team. And so the Taliban ran up into the mountains looking for them. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think there was about 80 Taliban. Now, SEALs are some of the best trained fighters we have in the modern world, but nobody's Superman. And if you got 80 people with machine guns coming after you, you're not going to last very long, right? So these SEALs are in the middle of this firefight. Taliban's coming down on them. And back on the base, the message comes through, our position's been given away. We're under heavy attack. We're not going to survive this. It's too much. And there was another team of SEALs on the base. And that team of SEALs said, we need to get into that mountain and we need to help our friends. And they were so desperate to get to the mountain and help their friends, they broke every single protocol that we're taught in the military. One of the basic things that they taught us over and over again is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. If you don't go slow, you don't go smooth. And if you don't go smooth, you're making too many mistakes. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Well, of course, when your friends are in trouble, that stuff goes out the window. They jumped in the first helicopter they could find. They hightailed it to the mountain. They're hovering over the mountain, getting ready to jump down on the ropes to help their friends. When a rocket-propelled grenade hits the helicopter, all of them die instantly. Just like that. And I remember when that happened, I was in Iraq, and our sergeants reminded us, no matter what's going on, you cannot break this rule. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Every ounce of your emotion might say, let's go, let's go. And I've met people like that in church. Even when we first started our missional community, we had people who came along. Like I said, our friend Peter, who'd been in church for 50 years and hadn't reached anyone for Jesus. They come and they're like, I'm ready to go. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Like, there's people who need Jesus. Let's move, let's go. But you gotta go slow. Because if you're not going slow, you're not going smooth. And if you're not going smooth, mistakes are made, things get wonky, and it doesn't last. And so don't rush this process. Take your time with Reimagine. Take your time with Rediscover. Remember, we're not the heroes. We're just finally stepping into a place where we're saying, God, we want to better be used by you. And we got to take our time with it so that we can do it well. Now, once you're done with Rediscover, you've shared your God stories, you've gotten vulnerable. Now you move into the reconstruct phase. And this is where you're beginning to rediscover what does it look like to be a missional community? What does it look like to build the kingdom of God in our secular world? And this is where the missional community training modules come in. That's those 5 steps that I showed you. That's where they come in. Now that process lasts 3.5 months. If you do it every Sabbath, which nobody does. So it usually lasts 6 months, okay? Just warning you ahead of time. It usually lasts 6 months. And by the time you're done with that, and by the way, we've had groups that didn't do the training and they just got into it. They're like, we're a missional community, let's go, let's get to action. And then a year or 2 later, they have to circle back around and do the training because the training is essential. You can't activate without this training. There's things to unlearn, there's things to relearn, there's things to anchor. And what we found with the groups who didn't do the training is they ended up with so many headaches and so many unnecessary stresses that they would have avoided if they had just done the training to begin with and then eased into their launch. So remember, it's not about hype. We have a hype culture in the church. We're used to, want to hype things up and make it look really big. It's not about hype. One of the quotes, I shared this with someone earlier today, but it's a quote that a friend of mine shared with me many years ago, and I never forgot it. And it's a quote that guided me this whole process. And it goes like this. I don't remember who said it again, some author somewhere, but it goes like this. Get ready for God to do something really, really small. Everyone always laughs when they hear that, because no, you don't expect that ending, do you? It's like, small, wait, that's not where I thought that was going. God does theatrical and incredible things throughout Scripture, but most of the time, He's working in really small ways. Really small ways. He doesn't need our hype. He just needs our faithfulness. So you go through that process, you take your time with it, you trust the process, and then once you've gone through the training, now you get to work and you figure the rest out as you go. And here's the thing. When you're finished, the training doesn't teach you everything. It can't. It's not possible. You will always have more to learn. But the learning that continues is learning that has to happen in action. Right? It's not learning that happens with a PowerPoint. It's learning that happens in action. And when you think about it, that's how Jesus discipled his disciples. He didn't sit them in a room with a whiteboard and a marker. He didn't have a PowerPoint, in a comfortable room. What did he do? He said, come follow me. They walked with him. They slept with him. They picked up tents and cleaned up and traveled with him. They saw everything he was doing. They imitated everything he was doing. This is an apprenticeship. That's what it means to be a disciple, is to be an apprentice of Jesus. An apprenticeship is not rational, it's hands-on. And so while there's some basic training that we want you guys to have, once it's time to launch, you launch. And by the way, this launch is actually not difficult. And the reason why is because if we come back here, remember that during that third phase, you're doing the training. If you come back here, you see those 3 steps? Community, crowd, companion, 5, committed, core. When you finish the first layer of training, which is number 1, which is about 5 to 7 modules, when you finish that layer of training, and this is what I often say to the groups I'm working with, if you don't start implementing the layers of training in layer 1, do not ask me to come back and teach you layer 2. I'm not coming. Now, why do I do that? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, layer 2 is not relevant if you're not applying layer 1. It's not relevant. It just becomes information. But here's the second reason. I did a lot of this training with missionary communities throughout the world. And here's what I found. In places like China, in places like Iran, when you share the gospel with someone, you're risking your life. You're risking your life. You could end up in jail. Women are often raped as part of the torture, interrogation in Iran. You're risking your body and your life. Are you going to risk your body and your life to go to someone's house and give them information they do nothing with? No. So in missionary societies in China and Iran, when they share the gospel with someone, if you're not obedient to what they shared, they're not coming back. Because they're not going to risk their life and their body just to give you rational data for you to do nothing with, right? They'll come back if you're willing to be obedient and apply what you've learned. They'll take that risk. But they're not going to take that risk just to pass on data that we don't do anything with. And I think that culture is really important. You say, look, let's be obedient to the cross at every step of the way. This is what God is asking here. And I have worked with some teams that didn't do that. And months later, we're finished with the training. They still haven't implemented anything. And I've realized, wow, I just wasted a lot of time. Because months later, they still hadn't implemented anything, and they still weren't implementing anything. And they were now just looking for the next training. And it's like, there's no more training. There's nothing left to teach you. You're supposed to be doing this stuff already, and then you figure out the rest as you go. So that's my encouragement to you guys. 3 phases to launch, really simple stuff. Whoops, I went too far. I don't know if I can get back. Maybe just get me back to that last slide if it's possible. 3 phases to launch: applying, obedience, every step of the way. And when you launch, everything else that you need to learn, you and the Holy Spirit and your team will figure it out as you go. And that's amazing because, final point I'll make, thank you very much. I'll just get this, there you go. Final point that I'll make is one of the challenges we have with church planting in the Adventist church is that we have too much information. Now, I don't know if you guys knew this, but when the church manual was first proposed to the General Conference, it was denied. There was sort of a unanimous vote. We're not going to have a church manual. Why don't we want a church manual? Because people will start depending on the manual, and all they need is scripture. Just scripture, man. That's all we need. Eventually, it got passed years later. But here's what I found. 9 times out of 10, when we plant a church today, what we basically do is we copy and paste the church manual. We have all these steps. We're like, here, copy, paste, and here's the God's honest truth. And maybe, hopefully, it's not too harsh, but you don't really need the Holy Spirit for that. Anybody can do it. Just copy and paste the church manual, tick the boxes, and you'll have some semblance of success. And you really don't need the Holy Spirit to do any of that. And what I love about missional community is that apart from some basic training, there's so much that has to be learned in action that you learn how to depend on the Spirit. Because you have to. Because there's too much you don't know. There's too much you can't know. There's too much I, as a trainer, could never figure out because every group is unique. Every context is unique. Every experience is unique. In my group in Coburn, we got both of my kids in that group. Guess what? Both of my kids are neurodivergent. What that means is my youngest son, who's Jaden, amazing kid, that kid doesn't sit still for anything. You try and do like a kid story or sing some songs, and he's autistic. So it's like, okay, well, how do we disciple him? Well, in another group, because we've only got 2 kids in the Coburn group. In another group, they've got 8 kids. Now, none of them are neurodivergent, but they're all like 4. So you can imagine. And then our Harrisdale team, one of the couples in that team adopted 4 kids this last year, 2 of whom are deaf. And so the team got together and said, let's all learn Auslan so we can talk to the kids. So you got all these people in the Harrisdale team learning Auslan every week now so they can communicate with the kids. These are all very unique differences only within the group itself. That's not to mention their external context. And so that's what I mean, that I'll never be able to put together a curriculum that answers all those questions. You got to have your basics, and then you go. And then it's obedience and the Holy Spirit that teaches you everything else you need to know. But outside of that, guys, it's really simple. An 8-year-old could follow this. Not that my 8-year-old would. He probably would get bored, but theoretically, it's simple enough that he could follow it. And that's it. That's 3 phases to launch. So if you guys have any more questions, you can ask questions about this. I'm also happy to answer any questions from the previous session as well, or even from this morning's sermons. And other than that, that'll be it for today. So yeah. Do we have a mic, like a roving mic? Yep, cool. I'm just going to grab my water bottle.
I might quickly start. I mentioned to you just during the break that if we as individuals, as a church, or even as a church, want to engage in this kind of missional communities, we don't want to feel like we're stacking things on top of this pile that you're talking about. What's it called? The pile?
The Jenga blocks.
There's different names for that, but yeah. I mean, 150 people in our church, on average. We've got about 30, 40 ministries. It's almost like we need to come down to about several key ministries so that people will be freed up and be able to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what you do is different. You're starting from that different space.
Mm-hmm.
But we're starting from this space. Have you worked with any other churches that are restructuring themselves in a way that
Yeah.
is working?
Really good question, man. I did work with a church that was restructuring itself, but unfortunately, this also happened to be the church that did not obediently apply the principles that were being taught. And so it just all ended up flopping. There's some pretty harsh realities when it comes to this, and one of them is the necessity of obedience. I think we've lost that. I think, especially for Adventists, the concept of obedience has been so marred by legalism that we kind of don't even want to hear that word anymore. But this is one of the core ideas of New Testament is radical obedience, right? Not radical obedience to ridiculous rules that make no sense, but radical obedience to what Jesus commands and what Jesus teaches. And that's what we see throughout the New Testament. Love one another as I have loved you. I mean, over 50 times that's repeated in the New Testament, And in many of our churches, it's more like tolerate one another. So there's this sense of there's some harsh realities that have to be wrestled with here. And to go more directly to your question, here's what I would say. There's really only two paths here that I know of. Now, I'm not a guru and I'm not a prophet, so I could be wrong, but there's really only two paths that I know of. One is a hybrid path, where as a conventional church, you say, we want to activate missional small groups while retaining the overall structure of the conventional church. And the best model I've seen for that is Johnny Wong's, right? Business Unusual, where what you're doing is, what Johnny Wong has essentially done is he's trimmed down the departmental model to basically elders and deacons, and then everything else is small group leaders, right? So that's the best model I've seen for that. But there's a harsh reality that comes with that model. And that is that you have missional leaders who are leading small groups, who are working full-time jobs and are busy leading small groups during the week. And then they're also coming to a big program on the weekends. And the effort that it takes to pull that program off, because again, Adventist churches are volunteer run. You don't have a paid staff that runs the program, right? So, can it work? I mean, look, it's worked really well for Johnny. Gateway Church, I believe is the name of his church. It has 4 different campuses in Melbourne, from what I'm aware. A part of it could be cultural. It's mostly Asians in that community, and that could be a part of why it's working. I don't know. I wouldn't die on that hill. But the harsh reality is they work really hard. They have their small groups going, and they have their weekend programs going. And in fact, I was talking to one of the guys who spent some time at Gateway Church, and this is what he told me. He's like, it's amazing and it's inspiring, but they work hard. It can be tiring, because you've got those two things that you're juggling. The other approach is the missional decentralized approach, where you basically say, we're going to train our groups, we're going to come up with a process and a system, we're going to train our groups, and we're going to multiply into these multiple small missional communities. But then what do you do with the building in a program? Because there's some hard conversations around that. You can't do both if you're going to go down that route, right? So those are the challenges that are there. For a conventional church, if you can pull off what Johnny Wong is doing, I think it's great, because then, hey, you still have use of all the things that are part of your natural structure. But if you're not going to do that, again, the only other real alternative is an actual decentralized network. And then, yeah, like I said, what do you do with the building? What do you do with, you can have a program once a month, but then what happens the rest of the time? Those are the honest conversations you got to have. Yeah.
Can there be something of a merger of those two? For example, if this church building become a center of influence and not a church, where it'll be a broad approach of various hubs that come out from this into the different networks.
Yeah.
And church could be still on a Sabbath, but it's very departmentally trimmed.
Yep.
And there are rather more workshops and hubs and youth drop-in centre and Elia Wellness
Yep.
stuff,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Church is just one
Yeah.
part of it rather than the main part.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that creates a culture for healthier networks
Yeah.
going out rather than just being stuck in a conventional and trying to juggle two different worlds.
Yeah, very true. So what you're saying is actually the third way. The only reason why I didn't mention the third way is because it's generally, not always, but generally impossible for Adventists. And the reason why is because this third way requires a full-time staff. You got to staff it. If you're going to have a center of influence that's open every day with different activities going, you got to staff it. So in Coburn, the Red Door Church, which is led by Pastor Adam Meredith, it's a Pentecostal church, they have a full-time staff, man. They've got all kinds of stuff happening all the time. But even their weekend program, there's a staff that contributes to making it happen. So they're not stretching their volunteers to breaking point, So if we can find a way, and some Adventist churches have found a way, I don't know how they did it, but there are some that have found a way to get a staff paid on site. They got a cafe on there, all kinds of stuff. If you can find a way to do that, I imagine it would take some collaboration with the conference. Then yeah, you could probably pull something like that off.
I'm trying to merge the changes that ADRA have taken over the last 10, 15 years in utilising localised community projects that can be utilised to get funding to actually fund this kind of things that we want to do. Rather than having a full-time paid staff, we get funding that could provide that funding for staff as well, because it'll come in line with some of these social, meeting people's needs, whatever, and it's not a financial burden on all of us.
That's right, yeah.
But it's money used well for the community.
Yeah, man, if you can find a way to make that tick, I'm not one of these, there's only one way that it can be done. I think that mentality is problematic. There's many ways, and context often dictates what is possible and not possible. What we're doing is what I refer to as a way, not the way, but it's a way. And there's other churches that are doing incredible things as well. I would recommend, I think it's Alex's brother, I forgot your name. Howie. Harley Davidson. We were having a conversation about this over lunch. So you guys need to get together and chat, because he's got some cool ideas, man. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Yep.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So what you're saying is we keep being out in the community, making our friends in the community. But until we've got that bit down packed, we don't proceed to step 2.
Let me go on my slides here. I'm not referring to this slide. I'm referring to this one here. So when you're actually doing the discipleship training. So that other slide is just your 3 phases until you launch, right?
Yeah, but launch what?
Until you launch this.
Yes.
Yep. So, but when you do, I wish I could have them both side by side. That would make this a little bit easier. But when you have those 3 phases, let me just explain the 3 phases really quickly here. You've got your reimagine, and then you're like rediscovering the gospel, and then you have reconstruction. Reconstruction is where you actually start doing this training. Okay? So the reconstruction phase is where you actually start doing the discipleship pathway. And by the time you launch, all that launch means is that you're finished and you're in full, all your gears are spinning. However, once you've done layer 1 of that training, you're already out there connecting with people. So you're not waiting until you launch to go start connecting with people. You have to start connecting with people, because again, layer 2, 3, 4, and 5 aren't all that meaningful if you're not actually connecting with people. When you come to layer 2 of training and people can actually sit there and say, well, I've been spending time with this person, I've been spending time with that person, and we've been having these conversations, and here's the struggles, and here's what's happening. Layer 2 training is really meaningful. But if no one's hanging out with anyone, layer 2 is kind of like, so what are we doing here, you know? So you start at layer 1. And that's okay, because what you'll find is, even if it takes you 6 months to finish this training, for the most part, especially if you're discipling secular people, they're not going to be ready to come to Red Space within those 6 months anyway. So you could just spend those whole 6 months training, and then all the other connections happening during the week. Does that help?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. I was afraid it would get a little mixed up there because I didn't have the 2 slides next to each other.
Sorry. I just thought. Could you just go through your various ministries and how we can connect with you online?
Sure, yeah. So there's really one key one, and that is if you go to thestorychurchproject.com, I have on there lots of resources, lots of materials for building missional communities, for training. There's just podcasts, blogs, books, online school, the whole 9 yards. And also, if you go to the r3network.com, that's actually our network's website, and it's got some training on there as well that you can access, some video training that I believe it walks you, I'm trying to remember, I think it walks you through, man, I can't remember actually. It's just some training on there. I just can't remember which one it is. I can't remember if it walks you through layer 1 of this or if it walks you through a more detailed version of this. I just can't recall at the moment. I recorded it like a year ago, and yeah, so I can't remember. But it's on there. So r3network.com. Yep. So with the Story Church Project, that's more of a personal project. I've been doing that for a number of years. We've got a podcast that is really popular. You guys might enjoy listening to it. So yeah, feel free to listen, subscribe, message in with your questions. I'm always on there with my good friend, Pastor Mario from Utah, doing some fun stuff. So, oh yes, I forgot about Hunger. So Hunger is a little bit different. Hunger, if you go to the hungerapp.com, that's a little bit different. Hunger is a project that Candace, my wife, and I do together. Remember I told you guys Candace is a therapist. So we launched a project together specifically to help people who have religious trauma. So people who've been severely wounded by the church or by harmful teachings, and it's not just for Adventists, it's for anyone. So whether someone was raised in a cult or they were raised in a high control religion with lots of toxic belief systems, Hunger is basically an app that we designed to connect with those people and help them on their healing journey. So that's thehungerapp.com. So yeah, thank you for for pointing that out. I forgot about that one.
So my question was actually about social media,
Cool.
which you've basically touched on. This is why it's good to let ladies go first. So thank you for that question. Because I was going to ask you maybe a compound question. What is the role that social media plays in your ministry or in these type of ministries? Because you didn't mention it at all since this morning, or at least since I've been listening.
Yeah.
So if you can maybe just touch on, aside from you've mentioned our podcast, your website, are you using things like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok? Are those even avenues that you consider to be valuable to invest time and effort in?
Yeah.
And my second part of the question would be, in the community section, or step 1, that's where we're supposed to be going out and making friends or building these relationships. What is the consideration for diversity in that step? Because if let's say I'm a mother of 3, chances are I'm going to meet other mothers of 3.
Yep.
And then if my core group is made of my friends who are also mothers, we end up having, this, what is it called? Discipleship space of mothers. Where does the young people come in, or the elderly people, or the teenagers, or the kids? And how do we navigate that diversity? So that's the second part of my question. Social media and the space.
Amazing questions. Good stuff, man. So with the social media one, we actually have a young person right now who's doing some training. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Justin Koo. He's got a discipleship, digital discipleship online school. So we've actually got a young person who's training through that school to build out our social media space over the next year. But we haven't focused on that to this point, and there's a really simple reason why. We're seeing social media as an amplifier of a message, a voice, and a culture that we have. And it's difficult to amplify something that's not there, right? So we decided to focus those first few years, let's build our culture, let's build the DNA, let's really identify how we communicate what our message is and focus on sharing that with our friends, with our natural spheres of influence. And if we're doing that well and we see that this is actually meaningful, it connects with people, then we can use social media to amplify it. But if it's not meaningful and it's not connecting with people, then we need to figure out why before we start amplifying it. So that's sort of the approach we've taken there with that. And because of the nature of a missional community, you end up, most of your, like, if I could say advertising, if you could call it that, is really underground. It's like networks. It's like friends I already have, people I already know. So there really hasn't been a need to like run ad campaigns or do anything loud on social media. But now we're getting to the stage where we're thinking it would be really good to start amplifying what we're doing. So that's our next step, actually. So I'm glad you asked that. Are you a social media guy? No. I was about to say, Rob, I'm sure would love to have some social media guys on his team.
We do have a digital media ministry that's growing.
Oh, sweet.
And obviously that's going to continue to grow and adjust to where the mission of the church is going.
That's fantastic, yeah. So if you want to be a social media guy, they got it going on. For your next question, yeah, that's a really good question. And so far, I would have to say it's something that we've worried about in terms of, if you have a group and most people belong to a specific demographic of that group, will that group lean heavily toward that demographic? Will we have diversity, et cetera? It's something that we've worried about, but because we were like, look, this is all we have, it's kind of like the Moses thing, like what's in your hand, It's like, this is all we have, so this is what we're going to work with. We just haven't found that that's really happened. So at the moment, yeah, like each of our groups are pretty diverse, but we're not really trying, I guess we're not like really trying to be diverse. We're not trying not to be, but we're not trying either. We're just kind of like, what's on our hands? Can we work with what we've got? And let's just see what happens. And things just, they just kind of happen. There is one group that has more kids than most other groups. And so they have to navigate that. And like I said, the group that just recently, one of the couples adopted some kids who were deaf. So they've had to navigate that as well. But yeah, it's never really come up as like, this group is all moms, like what's going on there? It just hasn't materialized that way. So yeah, sometimes it's one of those things where it's like, look, it could go that way, but let's just do it. This is all we've got. So let's work with what we've got and see what happens. And that's basically the approach we took. And so far, yeah, it hasn't moved in that direction, which is cool. I hope it continues to attract a diversity of people. Yeah. And that's true. What you guys will find as well is this is true not only of parent stage, but also of like ethnicity, because most secular Australians are white Australians. Right? They're the ones who are most impacted by postmodernism and by metamodernism. And if you don't know what those are, it's okay. You don't need to. But they're basically just worldviews, ways of thinking that are very irreligious. But what I have found over the last 10 years, and this is true in the Latino world as well, is that you'll have migrants who move to a Western country and they bring the culture of their home country with them. Like my Latino parents brought sort of the very religious, almost, they're Adventists, but they're basically like Catholics who go to church on Saturday because the culture is so Catholic in the Latin world, right? So they bring a lot of that with them. But then what happens is they're raising their kids in a super secular society. And so the kids grow up and they start to struggle with, when I'm at school or when I'm out during the week, the world is like this. And then when I go to church, it's like I step through a portal into a whole other dimension that makes no sense, So what we're starting to find is that there's a need within that space to be really intentional and diverse ethnically as well, because a lot of the younger generations who come from migrant families are the ones who are struggling the most to stay connected at church, because they're in two different worlds and they're struggling to make sense of that. So, Jesse.
If I can add on to that, and I've been quite distressed over it, because being a single dad of 3 kids who've been brought up in the church. I came down from college to Bunbury and I brought them up, but they're now all away from the church. One, unfortunately, is gay. One is an absolute rebel and doesn't want to know about the church or anything else. How do you reach them? You know, I mean, it's so distressing. And people say, oh, just pray over them. But there's got to be more than prayer. You've got to be able to physically reach out.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're talking about is de-churched ministry. There's unchurched ministry, which is your typical person who's never been to church before. We tend to call that unchurched ministry. A de-churched ministry is a person who has been to church and left for whatever reason. And they both have really unique challenges. The challenge with de-churched people is that they have, most of the time, baggage that needs to be processed. Unchurched people don't have any baggage, you know? So I'll give you an example. Growing up as an Adventist in a very religious society, when we were taught about the Sabbath, we were taught how to defend the Sabbath. Why? Because none of the other Christians around us, and almost everyone was Christian of some sort, they were either Catholic or some sort of evangelical denomination, none of them agreed with the Sabbath. So when our church taught us the Sabbath, they taught us how to defend the Sabbath. What I find when I study the Bible with secular people and I bring up the Sabbath, there's no need to defend it because they never heard of grace versus law. You know, they never heard of all of these arguments and debates that people get into within Christianity. So with a secular person, there's almost like a blank slate that you can have some of these conversations with. Not entirely, but to a certain degree. With de-churched people, you're dealing with a lot. You might be dealing with religious trauma. You might be dealing with experience of spiritual abuse. You might be dealing with a lot of unprocessed pain, wounds, frustrations, anger. But either way, and this is where my answer is coming to, what I have found is the missional job, or the job of the missionary, isn't to convince someone who wants nothing to do with God that they ought to have something to do with God. The job of the missionary is to connect with those people that are already open to what God is doing and say, God, how can I come alongside and journey with them? If you try and do the former, and well, first of all, you'll be really tired and depressed because it's impossible. And what I often say to people is, if the most powerful being in the universe isn't breaking through to this person, what am I going to do? You know, I'm just a Jersey boy. I'm not that cool, you know? But if a person is open to what God is doing in their life, I can come alongside and journey with them. And when it comes to de-churched people, the most important thing I have found, because we do have some de-churched people in our network. They left church for a very long time, had lots of wounds, lots of hang-ups, and they're now starting to reconnect and come back. But what opened them up to journeying with us is that our communities are safe spaces where they can actually say, here's why I'm angry and here's why I'm hurt, without somebody judging or defending the church. We just listen, you know? We listen and we point to Jesus. And that has been really, really essential in helping a lot of these de-church kids reconnect and start to rebuild their relationship with God a little. A lot of times people, even in the de-church community, might be interested in journeying with God, but they just, in their mind, they're like, man, if I go back to church, you know, it's not a safe space, there's judgment, there's this, there's that, forget it. I'm not gonna do it. So having safe communities is essential for that. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Yeah. All right, guys, can I take one more question? And I think I'll make this the last one because I'm gonna lose my voice here in a minute. So I've been talking all day, you guys. That's impressive even for me. Go on.
I have a question, but first of all, I'd just like to say that our church, because I count each week, we are 1/3 children, and they're little children. So we have an amazing mission field right here.
Oh, yeah.
With that number of kids. Question, finances and resources campuses and things, what does the missional group do for supporting it financially, and where you get your resources from, that type of thing? And is there any under the banner of the conference that's sort of in your church, or it's they run independent with financials type
Yep,
things?
yep. So I'll start with the financial one. We do have a bank account, like most churches. It does have money in it. We never really use it. We just don't need to. We don't have a building, we don't have bills. From time to time, we might hire a space for a special event, or we might pay for someone to get training, whether it's, like this young lady who's doing social media training. We've paid for people to do addiction recovery training, different types of things like that. But most of the time, someone will just put their hand up and say, oh, I'll help, I'll cover it. So yeah, we've got a bank and we've got some money. It hardly ever, we promote offerings mostly through the app. So in the different groups, we're just encouraging people, give offerings. But we're not in any sort of financial pinch because it's such a lightweight model with very little to no overhead. So money-wise, we're just not that stressed about it, not a big worry. But yes, we are under the conference. We initially started as a daughter church from the Livingston Church, and we've gotten big enough now that we just come directly under the conference. So we still follow all of the sort of the sort of tithe pathway that all churches follow. People tithe and give offerings through the app, and whatever goes to the conference goes there, and whatever comes local goes there. But yeah, ultimately though, and I think it's one of the things I love the most about the model, we just don't really need a lot of money. So, and even when you're engaging missionally within these circles that I showed you, it's so organic and it's so natural that you're discipling people. All of our groups are discipling people. And you're doing this without really spending any money. Now, resource-wise, there's different things. One of the things we have to be really careful with, because we really focus very specifically on secular mission, is there isn't always good Bible study options that they'll understand. So I personally wrote a Bible study guide for that demographic, for secular people, using a language that's more accessible to them. So we've used that, but from time to time, there are some other resources that we'll find. But apart from that, what we have found to be the best, to be honest, is just open the Bible and let's read it together. Even with the Bible study guide that I wrote, I often tell people, if you're studying the Bible with a person who's never been to church before, even with the guide that I wrote, which I wrote for that demographic, don't start with that. Just open a Bible, not the King James, please, something that they'll actually understand, and just read it. Just read it together and have conversations, open discussions, and it's pretty amazing. Especially nowadays, one of the things I found is millennials and Zeds, even though they're the least religious generations that we've ever had, they're also super duper spiritual. They're very interested. And the fact that they get to open an ancient book and read what's in it is pretty cool to them, especially if it's being done in a way that's engaging and open. So yeah, I don't know, for us, I haven't found anything that beats just a good old Bible, But yeah, in terms of specific resources that we've used, like I said, apart from the study set, and there's another one that, actually I might have it here in my bag.
6 weeks that you pay for somewhere to meet?
No. No, we don't. We just, we meet at one of our members' house. She's got a big house. Yeah, there is a barn near where all our groups are at that we do sometimes pay to meet at. But usually we just do that once a year for what we call a convocation, which is just to get the year started. We get all the groups together, we do some preaching and training. And that's really the only time of the year where you have that sort of more programming thing. Other than that, no. So this is what I was going to mention. This actually, the AUC put this out recently, and it's actually really good. It's called Dare to Connect. We ordered 100 of them, and I'll just show you a little bit. Connecting with families, connecting with Muslims, connecting with young adults, connecting with Buddhists, with teenagers, with Hindus. It's got it all. It even has a chapter called Connecting with Postmoderns. which was written by this weird guy named Marcus. So yeah, we just ordered like 100 of these from the AUC, and those are pretty nice as well. Yep. But yeah, we have to be careful because, you know, you can't just blindly go into the ABC and say, give me all these Bible studies, because most of our contexts, you spend more time explaining what a word means than actually studying the Bible, you know. So you don't want to do that. Okay, guys, I think I'm going to call it there.